Winter 1944, near Cagny, France. A British infantryman crouches behind a ruined stone wall, his breath visible in the cold morning air. Corporal James Miller clutches a weapon that looks more like a strange musical instrument than a military tool. 44 inches long, weighing 32 pounds, with a spade-like grip at the rear and a heavy steel cylinder at the front. To the approaching German Panzer IV tank, Miller appears as just another soldier hiding in the rubble. But as the tank closes to within 90 yards, Miller rises, places the PIAT's heavy front plate on his shoulder, and squeezes the trigger. The weapon recoils violently against his shoulder as a 2.5-pound high-explosive anti-tank grenade hurtles toward the German armour at 450 feet per second. 3 seconds later, the Panzer's side armour erupts in a shower of steel fragments. The tank lurches to a halt, smoke billowing from its crippled engine. Miller has just demonstrated why this peculiar British invention terrified German tank crews throughout the latter half of the war. This was the PIAT, Projector Infantry Anti-Tank. It fired a hollow charge grenade capable of penetrating 100 mm of armour, and it forced German tank commanders to reconsider their battlefield tactics. But the PIAT was far more than just another weapon. It was a desperate engineering solution to a problem that had haunted British infantry since the early days of the war. The real problem began in 1940. German panzer divisions were rolling across Europe with near impunity. British infantry found themselves virtually defenceless against armoured vehicles. The Boy's anti-tank rifle, issued at the war's beginning, fired a .55 caliber round that could only penetrate 21 mm of armour at 300 yards, useless against anything but the lightest German tanks. By the time Britain faced the Panzer III and IV, the Boy's rifle was little more than a noisy way to announce one's position before being crushed under 80 mm of rolled steel armour. British infantry needed something that could be carried by one man, deployed quickly, and destroy a tank at reasonable combat distances. The War Office specified a weapon effective against armour up to 100 mm thick, at ranges between 50 and 100 yards. It needed to weigh no more than 35 pounds, cost less than 10 pounds to produce, and be simple enough for basic infantry training. The constraints were brutal. The weapon had to be powerful enough to defeat armour yet light enough for one soldier to carry and operate. It needed to be accurate enough to hit a moving target but simple enough to manufacture under wartime conditions. Most critically, it couldn't rely on traditional propellant systems. The British had developed effective anti-tank grenades like the No. 68, but these required throwing distances of 20 to 30 yards, suicidal ranges against tanks with machine guns. The Americans had the bazooka, but its rocket propulsion created a massive backblast that revealed the operator's position instantly. The Germans had the Panzerfaust, but its single-shot design and limited range made it a defensive weapon of last resort. The British needed something different, something that could launch a shaped charge without the telltale signature of a rocket motor or the recoil of a conventional rifle. The solution emerged from the mind of Lieutenant Colonel Stuart Blacker, an inventive officer with a history of developing unusual weapons. Blacker's design abandoned traditional propulsion methods entirely. Instead of gunpowder or rockets, the PIAT used a massive spring and spigot mortar system. Here's how it worked. The operator first cocked the weapon by placing its feet on the ground and pulling the body upward, compressing a powerful mainspring that stored over 200 pounds of force. When loaded, the PIAT weighed 32 pounds and stood 44 inches tall, roughly the size of a short rifle but twice as heavy. The projectile itself was a 3-inch hollow charge grenade weighing 2.5 pounds, containing 1 pound 8 ounces of high explosive. When the trigger was pulled, the release spring drove a firing pin forward into a small blank cartridge in the base of the projectile. This cartridge ignited, launching the grenade down the spigot at 450 feet per second. As the grenade left the barrel, it automatically recocked the mainspring by redirecting a portion of the firing force through a clever mechanical system. In theory, this allowed rapid follow-up shots. In practice, the recocking mechanism worked only about 60% of the time, forcing many operators to manually recock the weapon between shots, a strenuous process requiring significant physical strength. The hollow charge technology was the PIAT's lethal secret. Developed by the Swiss chemist Henry Mohaupt, the shaped charge focused the explosive energy into a narrow jet of molten metal capable of piercing armour far thicker than conventional explosives could damage. the PIAT's grenade could penetrate 100 millimeters of homogeneous armor plate, enough to defeat the side armor of any German tank in service, including the formidable Panther and Tiger. At 100 yards, the PIAT could achieve a 50% hit probability on a stationary target the size of a tank's turret front. Against moving targets, effective range dropped to 50 yards or less. The weapon produced no muzzle flash or smoke, and its firing sound was less than 100 decibels, comparable to a rifle report and far quieter than the bazooka's 150 decibel roar. This relative quiet allowed for some degree of concealment after firing, though the distinctive metallic thwomp of the spring releasing was unmistakable to those who knew what to listen for. The development and production of the PIAT fell under the purview of the Ministry of Supply, with design work initially conducted at the Royal Small Arms Factory at Enfield. Blacker Bombardus, a small company named after the inventor, produced the first prototypes in 1941. By 1942, the Imperial Chemical Industries had taken over mass production, eventually manufacturing over 115,000 PIATs before the war's end. The cost per unit was remarkably low, just £12 10 shillings, compared to the American bazooka at over $50 per unit. Training was conducted at specialised centres across Britain, where soldiers learned the proper technique for cocking, aiming and firing the weapon. The physical demands of operating the PIAT meant that only the strongest soldiers typically carried it in infantry sections. Despite these challenges, the weapon was officially adopted in August 1943 and began seeing frontline service in Italy later that year. The first major combat test came during the invasion of Sicily in July 1943. Canadian forces facing German counterattacks found the PIAT effective against the older Panzer III and IV models, though the heavier Tiger tanks proved vulnerable only to flank shots. At the Battle of Monte Cassino in early 1944, British units used PIATs in defensive positions to destroy several German armoured vehicles attempting to break through Allied lines. One particularly dramatic engagement occurred near Anzio in May 1944, when a single PIAT team from the Scots Guards destroyed 3 German assault guns in succession, halting a localised counterattack. The weapon's most celebrated moment came during the D-Day landings and subsequent Normandy campaign. On June 6, 1944, British commandos using PIATs disabled several German armoured vehicles defending Sword Beach, allowing infantry to break out and establish their beachhead. Throughout the Battle of Normandy, PIAT teams became prized assets in British and Canadian infantry sections, often accounting for more tank kills than the accompanying towed 6-pounder anti-tank guns. The weapon's effectiveness against fortifications proved equally valuable. During the fighting in the Netherlands in late 1944, British soldiers used PIATs to destroy German concrete bunkers and machine gun nests that were otherwise difficult to neutralise. The hollow charge grenades could penetrate up to 12 inches of reinforced concrete, making the PIAT a versatile assault weapon beyond its anti-tank role. Perhaps the most remarkable demonstration of the PIAT's combat potential came on October 21, 1944, during Operation Market Garden. Private Ernest Allway of the 1st Battalion Border Regiment single-handedly destroyed a German self-propelled gun and killed or wounded its crew using a PIAT from a distance of approximately 100 yards. For this action, Allway was awarded the Victoria Cross, the highest decoration for valour in the British and Commonwealth Armed Forces. Despite these successes, the PIAT suffered from significant limitations that made it unpopular with many soldiers. The cocking process required tremendous physical strength. Some men simply couldn't compress the mainspring without assistance. The weapon weighed 32 pounds, making it burdensome to carry alongside other infantry equipment. The sight system was rudimentary, consisting only of a simple aperture and front post, making accurate fire difficult beyond 50 yards. The recocking mechanism frequently failed in combat conditions, forcing soldiers to manually reset the weapon between shots, a nearly impossible task while under fire. The projectile's relatively low velocity meant that hitting moving targets required considerable learning judgment, skills that demanded extensive practice. Perhaps most frustratingly, the PIAT had a dangerous minimum arming distance of 15 yards. Firing at closer targets risked the grenade not detonating at all. Training partially addressed these issues but never fully solved them. The British Army established specialised PIAT training schools, where soldiers practised on moving targets and learned proper aiming techniques. Experienced instructors developed methods to reduce the physical strain of cocking, including using the weapon's weight against itself and employing specific body mechanics. Still, the average infantryman typically achieved only a 30% hit probability on tank-sized targets at combat ranges, compared to the 50% rate of trained specialists. This discrepancy meant that PIAT teams were often composed of the best shots in a unit, creating manpower challenges when these soldiers were lost to combat or rotation. The PIAT's psychological impact on German forces cannot be overstated. Unlike the obvious backblast of a bazooka or Panzerfaust, the PIAT could be fired from concealed positions with relatively little signature. German tank crews learned to fear sudden explosions from seemingly empty hedgerows or ruined buildings. After-action reports from German armoured units in Normandy frequently mention mysterious explosions, disabling tanks without visible enemy positions. This uncertainty forced German tanks to operate more cautiously, often maintaining greater distances from potential ambush sites and reducing their close support effectiveness for accompanying infantry. Some German units began attaching additional armour plates, known as Schürzen, to their tanks' sides specifically to protect against hollow charge weapons like the PIAT. While these screens were primarily designed to defeat Soviet anti-tank rifles, they also provided some protection against PIAT grenades when properly spaced. The PIAT's greatest value emerged within the broader system of British anti-tank defence. It wasn't designed to win armoured battles single-handedly, but to fill a critical gap between hand-thrown grenades and towed anti-tank guns. In British infantry sections, the PIAT complemented other weapons in a layered defence. At distances beyond 200 yards, 6-pounder anti-tank guns and tank destroyers engaged enemy armour. Between 100 and 200 yards, PIAT teams could deliver effective fire. Below 100 yards, hand-thrown anti-tank grenades and sticky bombs provided last-ditch protection. This integrated approach meant that German armour faced continuous threats, regardless of its distance from British positions. The PIAT's portability allowed it to be deployed in terrain where larger weapons couldn't operate: urban ruins, dense hedgerows, and narrow village streets. During the fighting in Normandy's infamous Bocage country, PIAT teams often positioned themselves in hedgerows to ambush German tanks attempting to break through Allied lines. The weapon's influence extended beyond regular British forces. The PIAT was supplied to various resistance movements across occupied Europe, including French, Dutch, and Norwegian partisans. Its lack of smoke or flash made it particularly suitable for covert operations, where revealing the firing position meant certain death. Canadian forces used the PIAT extensively during the Italian campaign and later in northwest Europe. Australian units employed it during the Pacific campaigns against Japanese fortifications, though its effectiveness against bunkers was limited compared to dedicated demolition charges. The Soviet Union received approximately 1,000 PIATs through Lend-Lease, though they preferred their own PTRS anti-tank rifles and later the RPG series of rocket launchers. After the war, surplus PIATs found their way into various colonial conflicts, including the Malayan Emergency and the early stages of the Korean War. By 1945, the PIAT was already becoming obsolete. The war had demonstrated the value of shaped charge anti-tank weapons, but the PIAT's mechanical limitations pointed toward better solutions. The American bazooka, despite its backblast signature, offered superior range, accuracy, and ease of use. German developments like the Panzerfaust and Panzerschreck showed the potential of rocket propulsion. Post-war British anti-tank doctrine evolved toward recoilless rifles and early guided missiles, rendering the PIAT's spring-powered system anachronistic. Production ceased in 1945, though the weapon remained in British service until the early 1950s, gradually replaced by the Eniger rifle grenade and later the Carl Gustav recoilless rifle. Today, the PIAT survives primarily in museums and private collections. Approximately 115,000 were produced during its service life, with perhaps 2,000 remaining in various states of preservation. The Imperial War Museum in London maintains several examples, including one that saw action at Normandy. The Canadian War Museum displays a PIAT captured from a German position in the Netherlands. Perhaps most poignantly, a PIAT recovered from the battlefield at Arnhem occupies a place of honour at the Airborne Museum Hartenstein, a silent testament to the desperate fighting that took place there in September 1944. The PIAT represents a distinctly British approach to wartime engineering, pragmatic, resourceful, and sometimes eccentric. Faced with a critical shortage of effective anti-tank weapons and limited industrial capacity, British designers created a weapon that used simple mechanical principles to solve a complex problem. It wasn't elegant or sophisticated, but it worked. The PIAT filled a crucial gap in British infantry capabilities during the most desperate years of the war, buying time for more advanced systems to be developed and deployed. Its existence speaks to the British wartime mindset of making do with available resources and finding unconventional solutions to seemingly insurmountable challenges. The PIAT's legacy offers a stark lesson about military innovation. Weapons are not developed in a vacuum but emerge from specific operational contexts, constrained by available technology, manufacturing capacity, and tactical requirements. The PIAT was never intended as a permanent solution to the anti-tank problem. It was an emergency measure designed to keep British infantry in the fight until better weapons became available. In this limited sense, it succeeded admirably. German tank crews had genuine reason to fear the PIAT, not because it was technologically superior to other anti-tank weapons, but because it could appear anywhere and be deployed by any infantry section. This ubiquity made it a constant threat that forced German armour to operate with greater caution, reducing its tactical effectiveness. The story of the PIAT reminds us that military innovation is often about finding the right balance between competing requirements. The British could have produced more powerful anti-tank weapons, but these would have been heavier, more expensive and available in smaller numbers. They could have focused on rocket-propelled systems like the American bazooka, but these required different manufacturing capabilities and created tactical vulnerabilities of their own. The PIAT represented a compromise, a weapon that was good enough across multiple dimensions rather than exceptional in any single one. This balance of characteristics made it uniquely suited to British needs and resources during the latter half of World War II. The PIAT was not a miracle weapon. It was a system, imperfect, challenging to use, and rapidly superseded by more advanced designs. But for a brief period in history, it gave the British infantrymen a fighting chance against German armour, and in the desperate calculus of wartime that was enough. Obsolete is a word for peacetime. In combat, there is only what works and what does not.